Hello, welcome to Little Vintage World. In this video, I'm going to recommend to you five different books which discuss the history of fashion. Anything pre-20th century. Now, I am someone that has a lot of books on the history of fashion, be it vintage fashion or historical fashion, because I love learning about history of fashion. And I have a lot of books that are on particular decades. So for instance, I have books that are just on Edwardian fashion or just on 1920s fashion, etc, etc. But for this video, I've tried to do a selection of books that cover a lot of different parts of history. As I said, all kind of pre-1920s, I would say, for the most part. Now, let's get into it and let's talk about books that I think are the easiest kind of place to start when it comes to the history of fashion, because if we're talking historical fashion or costume, as some books might describe it as, it can be quite dense. It can be a bit like running through treacle, because history of fashion is so different throughout the whole of the world. And so I think a really good place to start is with a children's book. This is published by Usborne and it's a history of fashion. Usborne do some wonderful children's books on all different things. They do like science books and geography books as well as history books. But this book, for instance, will look at different fashions throughout the world at different times, and they'll talk about certain individual pieces, so certain materials that were used or very popular, what you would wear perhaps if you were wealthy or perhaps if you were poorer, working class, throughout different eras and times of history. Oh, very Jane Austen. I really like this. They do also cover vintage fashion as well, but for the most part I think this is really helpful in talking about the history of fashion and the types of cut and style that you could expect, and what was very popular at the time. So for instance, ruffs and rolls, you know, in the particularly at the time of Elizabeth I, this type of dress was really very popular. So yeah, I think a children's book is always wonderful. I always say, when I did my where to start getting into history, I actually said the best place to start getting into a certain area of history is with children's books, and I've said that with classic literature as well. And I think it's because when you look at children's literature, it's accessible, and it has to be accessible, and therefore non-fiction is accessible as well. So I think that's a great place to start with. Next up, I also think this is wonderful. This is a little Pitkin guide, and it's absolutely fantastic. Oh, my notes. And this is a really informative, oh, of course I stop on the page of Elizabeth I, of course I do, hello. This is really informative but also really illustrative as well. And it is really fascinating. It's one of these things that you can read rather quickly, but you learn so much, and it's so well edited and put together. Again, this book does very briefly touch on vintage fashion. For instance, at the end we have a little section, just a couple of pages on 1900 to the year 2000. But for the most part, we are from the year 1500 onwards, focusing on Tudors, Stuarts, the Georgians, and what was popular, and with some lovely, beautiful examples like these wonderful shoes. So yes, highly recommend these guides. I think they're great. Another book that I love, but this is a vintage book, so I'm not quite sure how easy it is to get hold of, because I've had this for a really long time. My late uncle bought it me because he knew that I love history of fashion. And it is this book, A History of English Costume by Iris Brooke. It is this beautiful vintage edition, and it has most wonderful illustrations, black and white illustrations throughout. And this is a real historic, we go really far back. We go back to, when did we start? We start in 1066, of course, with William the Conqueror, and then we go all the way through up to 1900. So it's perfect for the time that I'm speaking of. Why do I keep going to Elizabeth I? I have a problem. But I really like here, like they're talking about certain pieces, and they'll break the piece down, and I think that's really, really good. And there's a few colour plates in there as well. So if you can get your hands on this, this is really wonderful. I have to say my most beautiful book on the history of fashion is this one. This is Fashion, A History from the 18th to 20th Century. This is from the collection, the Kyoto Costume Institute. This is it. It is very, very chunky. It's hardback. It is gorgeous. And as I said, it is by far my most beautiful book on the history of fashion. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't the most informative, but it provides the most wonderful, wonderful examples. Look. If that doesn't shout Downton Abbey, what does? It is honestly the most beautiful, beautiful book that you can have a flick through and see the most wonderful, beautiful fabrics, beautiful cuts and designs, and beautiful examples of dress through history. So it's one of my faves. And last but not least, a book that I think is really rather informative when it comes to historical fashion, and this is The Art of Dress, Clothes in Society 1500 to 1914 by Jane Ashford, sorry. And this was published by the National Trust. And this, ooh, if I balance, as you can see, has images in, but also it's rather word heavy. And it is that balance between history, sociology, society, and also fashion. And it's that balance of, this is the type of thing that so-and-so would have worn, and this is why. You know, everything from who's wearing gold and silver to what are the poorest people wearing, what was most available, and all that type of thing. This is probably the most informative piece, but obviously it's the most heavy as well. So those are my 5 books that I would recommend to you if you're wanting to start learning about the history of historical fashion, so anything kind of pre-1920-ish, and hopefully from then on you can then disperse and go into particular decades that you find in particular rather fascinating. So that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed your time here. Perhaps you've learned something new. Take care, and I shall see you very, very soon for my next one. Bye for now.